At my wedding, my parents glared at my child and hissed, "Get that stray out of the photos." My siblings smirked. My son cried. But my fiancé raised his glass and made them scream. Let me tell you something about growing up invisible. You do not realize it is happening until you are an adult, staring at your own reflection, wondering why you feel the constant, exhausting need to apologize just for existing. My name is Caroline. I am 32 years old, and for the first 29 years of my life, I was not a daughter, a sister, or a person. I was a safety net. I was the family bank. I was the emergency contact they only called when the golden children made a mess. I have an 8-year-old son named Finn. Finn is the kind of kid who notices when you are having a bad day and quietly slides his favorite toy car onto your lap without saying a word. He is sensitive, thoughtful, and the absolute center of my universe. I had him when I was 24, right out of a terrible, brief relationship that I do not like to talk about. From the moment I brought Finn home from the hospital, it was just the two of us against the world. And then there was my family. My mother, Evelyn, and my father, George. They had a very specific hierarchy in our household. At the top was my older brother, Cameron. Cameron could do no wrong. If Cameron failed a class, the teacher was out to get him. If Cameron got fired, the boss was intimidated by his potential. Right below him was my older sister, Chelsea. Chelsea was the princess, the one destined for a wealthy husband and a big house. And then, somewhere in the basement of their priorities, there was me. Because I was quiet, responsible, and got a decent job as an accountant early on, they figured I did not need love or attention. What I needed to do, in their eyes, was pay the toll for being part of the family. When I was 22, I had saved up about $12,000 for a down payment on a small condo. I was so proud of it. Then Cameron got drunk, wrapped his leased car around a street lamp, and suddenly, my mother was in my living room crying. She told me Cameron would go to jail, his life would be ruined, and a good sister would step up. I drained my savings. Every single penny. I paid the damages, covered the lawyer fees, and Cameron never even gave me a real thank you. He just nodded at me at Thanksgiving and said it was cool of me to help out. 2 years later, Chelsea decided she wanted to start a luxury organic soap business. She needed $15,000 for branding and inventory. My father took me to dinner, looked me in the eye, and told me that family invests in family. He said they were a little tight on cash, and it would break Chelsea's heart if she could not chase her dream. I took out a personal loan to give her the money. Her business lasted exactly 3 months before she got bored and went on a vacation to Europe. When I had Finn, things got worse. My parents looked at my son like he was a stain on the family portrait. An unplanned kid with a single mom. They did not see a beautiful baby boy, they saw a burden. They used him as an excuse to demand more from me. They would say things like, since I was not going out and having a social life anymore, I must have extra money to help with the property taxes on their house. And, because I was conditioned to seek their approval, I paid it. I kept paying, fixing, and bleeding myself dry just to hear my mother say she was proud of me. She never did. But everything started to shift when Grant walked into our lives. Grant was 35, a structural engineer with kind eyes and a patience I had never seen in another human being. He did not look at me like I was a problem to be solved, and more importantly, he did not look at Finn like he was a burden. He looked at us like we were a family he had been waiting for. For the first time in my life, I had someone standing between me and the people who wanted to use me. And that is when the real trouble started. Grant was different. He was the kind of man who showed his love not with grand, empty speeches, but with steady, quiet actions. While my own father, George, could barely remember what grade Finn was in, Grant was sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night, using pieces of cereal to help Finn understand basic subtraction. I remember Finn's 7th birthday. My parents came over for exactly 45 minutes. George handed Finn a crisp $20 bill inside an envelope that did not even have his name on it. Evelyn complained about the smell of the pizza I ordered, took 2 pictures for her social media to prove she was an involved grandmother, and then they left. They did not bring a toy. They did not ask him what he was interested in. That same afternoon, Grant took Finn to the park. He had spent the entire week secretly fixing up a second-hand bicycle, painting it bright red, which was Finn's favorite color. I sat on a park bench and watched Grant run alongside that bike for 2 hours, his hand hovering just behind the seat, cheering until his voice went hoarse. When Finn finally balanced on his own and pedaled away, Grant looked back at me with a smile so bright it made my chest ache. Finn fell once and scraped his knee. Instead of telling him to toughen up like my family would have, Grant sat in the dirt with him, put a bandage on it, and gave him a high five for being brave. That was the day I knew I was going to marry him. That was the day Finn started looking at Grant like he hung the moon. When Grant proposed, it was the happiest moment of my life. But the second we announced the engagement to my family, the atmosphere shifted. They were not happy for me. They were panicked. A husband meant someone else would be looking at my finances. A husband meant I was no longer an independent ATM they could tap into whenever Cameron needed bail money or Chelsea needed a wardrobe update. The wedding planning became a battlefield. We decided to pay for the wedding entirely ourselves, mostly because we knew accepting a single dime from my parents would come with a lifetime of emotional debt. We kept it reasonable, a beautiful outdoor venue with about 80 guests. But Evelyn could not stop inserting herself, and every comment was a subtle demand for cash. We would be looking at catering options, and she would scoff, saying $35 a plate was a ridiculous waste of money. She would look right at me and say I could easily give that money to Cameron to help him with his rent, rather than feeding people who were just going to eat and leave. I tried to ignore it. I tried to keep the peace. Behind the scenes, things were getting stranger. About 2 months before the wedding, we were trying to upgrade my car. We went to the dealership, applied for the financing, and the manager came back looking confused. He told us my credit score had taken a massive hit recently due to a high debt-to-income ratio and several hard inquiries I did not recognize. I was baffled. I had not opened a new card in years. Grant looked at the paperwork, his brow furrowing, but when he saw the panic rising in my eyes, he gently folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He told me it was probably just an administrative error, and he would look into it for me. I trusted him, so I let it go. I was too stressed about the wedding flowers, the seating charts, and my mother's constant complaints to worry about a bank glitch. I did not know it then, but Grant did not let it go. He started pulling threads, and what he found would eventually blow my entire bloodline out of the water. But for those last few months, he kept his mouth shut. He wanted me to have my perfect day. He wanted me to feel beautiful and loved. The morning of the wedding was supposed to be magical. And for the first few hours, it was. We rented a large bridal suite at the venue, a historic estate with massive windows overlooking a garden. The sun was shining, my best friends were pouring orange juice and champagne, and the air smelled like hairspray and fresh roses. But the highlight of my morning was Finn. He was the ring bearer. My friends helped him into his tiny black tuxedo, complete with a dark green bow tie that matched the bridesmaids' dresses. He kept walking up to the full-length mirror, adjusting his little cuffs and trying to stand as tall as possible. He looked so incredibly handsome, and he was taking his job very seriously. I was sitting in the makeup chair when Finn walked over, resting his hands on my knees. He looked up at me, his big brown eyes filled with this intense, serious emotion. He asked me if, after today, when Grant put the ring on my finger, it meant they were officially best friends forever. I laughed, brushing his hair back, and told him yes, they were best friends forever. Then he looked down at his shiny black shoes and mumbled, very quietly, asking if it was okay if he started calling Grant Dad. I almost ruined my makeup right then and there. I pulled him into a hug, burying my face in his shoulder, and told him that Grant would love nothing more in the entire world. Finn beamed. His smile could have lit up the entire city. He was so full of joy, so innocent, so ready to finally have a complete family. And then, the door to the suite opened, and the illusion shattered. My family arrived. Evelyn, George, Cameron, and Chelsea walked into the room, and it felt like someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the space. There were no warm greetings. There were no tears of joy. Evelyn immediately started complaining about the gravel driveway ruining the heels of her shoes. George went straight to the corner and started checking his emails on his phone, completely ignoring the fact that his daughter was sitting there in a wedding dress. Cameron looked hungover, wearing a suit that looked like he had slept in it, and Chelsea immediately started critiquing the lighting in the room, saying it was washing out her complexion. None of them looked at me. And more importantly, none of them looked at Finn. Finn, still riding the high of our conversation, ran up to my mother. He tugged on the sleeve of her expensive dress and said, "Look, Grandma, I have a tuxedo just like a grown-up." Evelyn did not smile. She did not kneel down to tell him he looked handsome. She simply pulled her arm away, smoothed out the fabric of her sleeve, and gave him a tight, forced half-smile. She said, "Yes, very nice. Now go play somewhere else so you do not get dirt on my outfit." Finn's smile faltered. He took a step back, his little hands dropping to his sides. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream at her, but the old, ingrained fear kept my mouth shut. I told myself it was just nerves. I told myself she was just stressed about the event. I made an excuse for her, just like I had done every single day of my life. I called Finn over to me and distracted him with a piece of candy. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, suffocating. My bridesmaids noticed it. They quietly formed a protective wall around me, keeping the conversation light, trying to drown out Chelsea complaining about the makeup artist and Cameron asking if the open bar had started serving yet. I sat there, staring at myself in the mirror, wearing a beautiful white dress, but feeling like that same terrified 12-year-old girl who was never good enough. I kept repeating in my head that it would be over soon. We just had to get through the ceremony, get through the photos, and then Grant and I would be free. I just had to keep the peace for a few more hours. I did not realize that the peace was about to be violently ripped apart, and that my parents were about to cross a line so dark there would be no coming back. The ceremony was beautiful. When I walked down the aisle and saw Grant standing there, wiping a tear from his eye, the rest of the world faded away. For those 20 minutes, it was just me, the man I loved, and my sweet boy standing proudly next to him, holding a small velvet box. We exchanged our vows, we kissed, the crowd cheered, and we walked back up the aisle as husband and wife. Immediately after the ceremony, the wedding coordinator ushered us toward the garden for family portraits. This is always the most stressful part of any wedding, trying to wrangle relatives and get everyone looking in the same direction. The photographer, a very energetic woman named Sarah, started calling out groups. We did the bridal party, we did Grant's family, who were laughing and hugging and pulling Finn into every single shot. Grant's mother even kissed Finn on the cheek and told him he was the most handsome ring bearer in history. Then it was time for my side of the family. Sarah called for the bride's parents and siblings. Evelyn, George, Cameron, and Chelsea stepped into the frame. They positioned themselves perfectly, pasting on these glossy, magazine-ready smiles that did not reach their eyes. I stood in the middle, holding my bouquet, feeling the familiar tension radiating from them. Finn, who had been standing with Grant's parents, heard the photographer call for the bride's family. In his innocent, 8-year-old mind, he was part of that family. He jogged over, his little face flushed with excitement, and naturally went to stand next to his grandmother, Evelyn. He squeezed into the gap between Evelyn and Chelsea, looking right at the camera, giving a big, goofy, gap-toothed smile. The photographer raised her camera. "All right, everyone look here, on 3. 1, 2, stop." The word cut through the warm afternoon air like a blade. Evelyn dropped her fake smile. She looked down at Finn, her expression twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. She physically stepped away from him, pulling her silk dress tight against her legs as if he were carrying a disease. She did not whisper. She did not try to hide it from the photographer or the guests lingering nearby. She glared right at my 8-year-old son and hissed, "Get that stray out of the photos. Let's not pretend he's part of this family." Time stopped. I felt the blood drain completely out of my face. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. I could hear a glass clink on a table 50 feet away. I looked at my siblings. I expected them to be shocked. I expected Cameron to tell Mom to chill out or Chelsea to awkwardly laugh it off. Instead, Cameron rolled his eyes and smirked. Chelsea let out a heavy sigh and nodded, crossing her arms. George stared straight ahead, completely indifferent, validating his wife's cruelty with his silence. And then I looked at Finn. My sweet, brave little boy. The boy who just wanted to call Grant Dad. The boy who had practiced his smile in the mirror all morning. I watched his heart break in real time. His shoulders collapsed inward. His bottom lip began to tremble. A tear spilled over his eyelashes, leaving a wet track down his cheek. He looked down at his shiny black shoes, stepped out of the frame, and started walking backward, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the garden. The photographer slowly lowered her camera, her mouth slightly open in shock. I stood there, paralyzed by a lifetime of conditioning. My brain was screaming at me to protect my child, but the abused, terrified little girl inside me was whispering, "Do not make a scene, do not ruin the photos, just apologize and fix it." I opened my mouth, but before I could form a single word, I felt a strong hand grab my shoulder. Grant stepped into the frame. He did not rush. He did not look frantic. He walked with a slow, terrifying calmness. He walked right past me, straight toward my mother. He stopped about 2 feet away from her. The height difference was massive. He towered over her, casting a long shadow. He held a glass of champagne in his right hand. He looked Evelyn dead in the eye, and the look on his face was something I had never seen before. It was absolute, freezing rage. "What did you just say?" Grant asked. His voice was not a yell. It was low, steady, and so cold it made the hair on my arm stand up. Evelyn blinked, taken aback for a split second, before her arrogant mask slipped right back into place. She let out a scoff, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, do not be dramatic, Grant. You know exactly what I mean. We want a picture of the real family. The bloodline. We can take one with the boy later if you really need to." Grant stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, he raised his glass in the air. He turned his head so the entire garden, the photographer, the catering staff, and all the lingering guests could hear him. "Let's get something straight," Grant announced, his voice booming effortlessly across the lawn. "This boy is my son. From this second forward, he is my blood. And I will be damned if I let a group of bitter, manipulative parasites stand at my wedding and insult my child." Evelyn gasped, clutching her chest. George immediately puffed out his chest and took a step forward. "Listen here, you son of a bitch, you do not talk to my wife that way. You show some respect." "Respect is earned, George," Grant fired back instantly, cutting him off. "And you have done nothing but steal from Caroline's soul since the day she was born. There will be no photos. There will be no dinner for you. You are done here. All 4 of you. Get out of my wedding." The shock on their faces was priceless. Cameron dropped his smirk. Chelsea looked around nervously as people started staring. Evelyn's face turned bright red. She looked at me, expecting me to intervene, expecting me to play the role of the obedient peacemaker. "Caroline," Evelyn snapped, her voice shrill. "Are you going to let this man speak to your mother this way? Tell him to apologize immediately, or we are leaving." It was the ultimate test. It was the same threat she had used my whole life to keep me in line. Comply, or lose our love. But as I stood there, looking at my husband defending my child, looking at Finn wiping his eyes in the background, something inside me finally snapped. The chains of guilt dissolved. I took 2 steps forward, standing right beside Grant. I looked my mother in the eyes, feeling completely, utterly numb to her manipulation. "He does not need to apologize," I said clearly, my voice shaking just a little before it found its strength. "He said exactly what I should have said years ago. You are not my family. You are just people I share DNA with. Now get your things and get off this property. If you are not gone in 2 minutes, I will have security throw you out." Evelyn opened her mouth, but nothing came out. George grabbed her arm, his face purple with fury. "Fine," he spat. "You want to throw us away for this trash? Have a nice life, Caroline. Do not come crying to us when everything falls apart." They turned and walked away. Cameron muttered something under his breath, and Chelsea stomped her heels on the pavement as they marched toward the parking lot. I watched them go. I watched the toxic cloud that had followed me my entire life walk right out the gates. Grant set his glass down, walked over to Finn, and scooped him up into his arms. He held him tight, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "You are my son," Grant whispered to him. "Do not ever let anyone tell you different." Finn wrapped his arms around Grant's neck and buried his face in his shoulder. I walked over and wrapped my arms around both of them. We stood there, holding each other, while the rest of the wedding watched in stunned silence. For 3 weeks after the wedding, I heard absolutely nothing from my family. No text messages. No missed calls. No passive-aggressive emails. Nothing. It was a complete and total blackout. For a normal person, this would be a blessing. But when you have been raised by narcissists, silence is not peace. Silence is a weapon. I spent the first week jumping every time my phone buzzed. I was trapped in a psychological war with my own brain. The trauma bond is a terrifying thing. Even though my mother had verbally abused my child at my own wedding, a twisted, sick part of my mind kept telling me that I was the one who ruined the day. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, hearing Evelyn's voice telling me I was ungrateful. I kept fighting the deeply ingrained urge to pick up the phone, call her, and beg for forgiveness just to make the heavy feeling in my chest go away. Grant saw what it was doing to me. He watched me pace around the kitchen, chewing my fingernails down to the quick. He watched me jump at the sound of the doorbell. He knew exactly what they were doing. They were starving me out. They were waiting for me to crack, assuming that without their toxic validation, I would come crawling back, ready to open my wallet and resume my role as the family doormat. So, at the start of the second week, Grant packed our bags. He rented a small, secluded cabin up in the mountains, near a lake, where cell service was completely non-existent. He packed Finn's favorite board games, a bunch of hot chocolate, and told me we were going off the grid. Those 4 days in the mountains saved my sanity. Without the constant hum of anxiety, without the ability to check my phone to see if my mother had posted some vague, guilt-tripping quote on social media, I finally started to breathe. We spent our days hiking through the pine trees, skipping rocks on the glassy surface of the lake, and sitting by the fire pit roasting marshmallows. I watched Grant and Finn interact. Grant taught him how to build a fire, patiently showing him how to stack the kindling. He listened to Finn talk endlessly about video games and dinosaurs, never once checking his watch or telling him to be quiet. I watched my son's smile slowly return. The shadow that had fallen over him at the wedding began to lift. He felt safe. We felt safe. On the last night at the cabin, Grant and I were sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the crickets. I rested my head on his shoulder and finally said it out loud. "I am terrified of what happens when we go back," I whispered. Grant pulled me tighter against him. "They are going to try to act like nothing happened," he said calmly. "That is how these people operate. They push you to the absolute limit, and then they reset the board. They will wait until they need something, and then they will show up, expecting you to fall back into line." "What if I cannot do it?" I asked, a tear slipping down my cheek. "What if she looks at me, and I just turn back into that terrified little girl?" Grant took my face in his hands. "You will not. Because you are not that little girl anymore. You are a mother. And you know exactly what they will do to him if you let them back in." He was right. That was the anchor I needed to hold on to. I could forgive a lot of things they did to me, but I could never, ever forgive what my mother said to my son. I made a promise to myself that night under the mountain sky. I was done paying for their love. The bank was officially closed. We drove back to the city feeling refreshed, a united front. I felt strong. I felt ready to face whatever manipulative tactic they threw at me next. I just did not expect it to happen on a random Tuesday morning, right in my own kitchen. Thank you for following the story this far. If you empathize with what I'm going through, please hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part, and don't forget to leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more people. Thank you very much. It was a Tuesday morning. The air in our house was finally starting to feel light again. We had been back from the mountains for about a week, and Finn was back to his normal, cheerful self. He was sitting at the kitchen island, his little legs dangling off the stool, humming a song while he colored a picture of a superhero. Grant had already left for the office, and I was standing by the coffee maker, enjoying the quiet routine of a normal life. Then I heard the sound of a key turning in the front door lock. My heart dropped into my stomach. I had given my mother a spare key 3 years ago for emergencies, but she had always treated it like an all-access pass to my life. I had completely forgotten to ask for it back or change the locks after the wedding. I froze, the coffee mug hovering halfway to my mouth as the front door swung open and slammed shut. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed down the hallway. Finn stopped humming. He looked up from his coloring book, his eyes wide, and when Evelyn walked into the kitchen, his whole body tensed. He immediately dropped his crayons, slid off the stool, and quietly scurried down the hall to his bedroom, shutting the door tightly behind him. Evelyn did not even look in his direction. It was as if a ghost had just floated past her. She walked into my kitchen wearing a designer beige trench coat, carrying a leather handbag that probably cost more than my first car. She acted completely normal. She did not look apologetic. She did not look angry. She just looked like a woman dropping by to see her daughter on a random Tuesday. She walked straight to my refrigerator, opened it, let out a disappointed sigh at my selection of groceries, and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water. She twisted the cap off, took a sip, and leaned against the granite counter, looking at me expectantly. I stood there, paralyzed, trying to process the absolute audacity of this woman. It had been nearly a month since she had looked my son in the eye and called him a stray in front of 80 people. And here she was, drinking my water. I finally found my voice. I asked her what she was doing in my house. She rolled her eyes, the classic Evelyn move whenever someone asked a question she deemed dramatic. She waved her hand in the air and said she was in the neighborhood looking at the new car dealership down the highway. She said George's sedan was getting too old, and they really needed something bigger, like a luxury SUV, for their weekend trips. Then, she looked right at me and dropped the bomb. She said the down payment on the SUV they wanted was about $12,000, and since my credit was usually better for auto loans, it would make sense for me to co-sign and handle the down payment. She said it casually, like she was asking to borrow a cup of sugar. She did not mention the wedding. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask how Finn was. She just walked into my house, ignored my child, and asked me for $12,000. I stared at her, feeling a strange sensation bubbling up in my chest. For 29 years, that sensation had been guilt. It had been an overwhelming, suffocating need to please her. But as I looked at her standing there, perfectly groomed and completely devoid of empathy, the guilt did not come. Instead, it was replaced by a cold, sharp, crystal-clear rage. I realized she really thought I was that stupid. She really believed that the conditioning she had drilled into my head since childhood was so strong that she could publicly humiliate my family, wait 3 weeks, and then just demand a new car. She thought I was a broken machine that just needed to be plugged back into the wall. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. The ceramic clinked loudly in the quiet kitchen. I looked Evelyn directly in the eyes, and for the first time in my entire life, I did not break eye contact first. I told her no. She blinked, confused. She asked me what I meant by no. She actually chuckled a little, as if I had just told a bad joke. She reminded me that I had a great job, that Grant made excellent money, and that family helps family. She started using her soft, manipulative voice, the one she used right before she dug her claws in. She told me George had been having back pain and the sedan was just too low to the ground for him. I cut her off. I told her I did not care about George's back pain. I told her I did not care about the SUV, and I was not giving her a single dollar. Her face hardened. The soft, manipulative grandmother act vanished, replaced by the vicious, entitled woman I knew so well. She slammed the water bottle down on the counter. She demanded to know what my problem was. She told me I was acting hysterical and holding a grudge over a tiny emotional outburst at the wedding. She actually used the word tiny. That was it. The dam broke. I did not yell, but my voice was shaking with years of repressed anger. I told her that she did not just have an outburst. I told her she verbally abused an 8-year-old boy. I told her she ruined what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and she did it simply because she could not stand the fact that I was prioritizing someone over her. And then I started listing the financial drains. I told her I was done. I told her I would no longer be paying Chelsea's university tuition. I told her the monthly deposits I had been sending to cover Cameron's rent were stopping today, and the $500 a month I had been sending her and George for their property taxes was over. The Bank of Caroline was permanently closed. Evelyn went dead quiet. She stared at me, her eyes darting across my face, searching for a sign of weakness. She was waiting for me to backtrack. She was waiting for me to apologize and say I was just stressed. When I did not, her face turned pale, and then it twisted into a sneer. She let out a dry, mocking laugh. She told me I was bluffing. She said I did not have the guts to cut off my own flesh and blood. She told me that without them, I was nothing. I walked over to the front door and pulled it open. I stood there, gesturing toward the porch, and told her to leave my house and leave her key on the table. She grabbed her expensive handbag, her knuckles white. She marched toward the door, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floor. But right before she crossed the threshold, she stopped. She turned back to look at me, her eyes filled with pure, unadulterated venom. She looked me up and down, completely disgusted. She told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. She said, "You are choosing some man and a stray over the people who raised you." I did not flinch. I looked right back at her and said, "I am choosing a real family over a group of parasites." I held my hand out. She threw the spare house key onto the floor, turned around, and walked to her car. I shut the door, locked the deadbolt, and leaned against the wood. I was shaking from head to toe, but my chest felt incredibly light. I had finally fought back. But I knew the war was far from over. 2 weeks passed. I had officially canceled the automatic transfers from my checking account to Chelsea's university portal, and I had blocked Cameron's number after he sent me 10 furious text messages calling me a selfish brat for cutting off his rent money. I felt like I was detoxing from a poison I had been drinking my whole life. Then, on a Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from Chelsea. She had sent a picture of our old backyard from when we were kids. In the photo, I was about 10 years old, pushing Cameron on a tire swing while Chelsea sat on the grass. Beneath the photo, she wrote a long, seemingly emotional paragraph. She said Mom and Dad were heartbroken. She said the family felt shattered, and they realized they had let things get out of hand. She invited me to a family dinner at my parents' house on Sunday evening to talk things through and heal. But it was the very last sentence of her text that caught my attention. She wrote, "Please come, and you can bring the boy if you want." The boy. Not Finn. Not my son. Just the boy. I showed the message to Grant. He read it, his jaw clenching, and told me it was a trap. He said narcissists do not heal, they re-strategize. He begged me not to go. But a small, foolish part of me, the part that still mourned the family I never really had, wanted to believe there was a tiny sliver of hope. I needed to see them one last time to know for sure that there was nothing left to save. I told Grant I was going, but I was going alone. I was not bringing Finn anywhere near that house. I arrived at my parents' house at 6 o'clock on Sunday. When I walked through the front door, the first thing I noticed was the smell. There was no food cooking. There was no music playing. The house felt cold and sterile, like a doctor's waiting room. George was sitting in his recliner, watching a sports game on mute. Cameron was slouching on the sofa, scrolling on his phone. Chelsea was sitting at the dining room table, filing her nails. Evelyn emerged from the kitchen holding a glass of wine. She looked at me, looked behind me, and raised an eyebrow when she saw I was alone. She gave a fake, exaggerated sigh and said she supposed it was for the best that I did not bring the child, since this was an adult conversation. I did not sit down. I stood at the edge of the living room and asked them what we were doing here. Chelsea put her nail file down and launched into a rehearsed speech. She used all the buzzwords she had probably learned from social media therapy pages. She told me they were deeply concerned about my mental health. She said I was isolating myself. And then, she looked right at me and said they were worried Grant was controlling me, brainwashing me into abandoning my support system. It was classic gaslighting. They were trying to convince me that the man who protected me was the villain, and the people who abused me were the victims. George stood up from his recliner and walked over to the dining table. He picked up a manila folder and slid it across the polished wood toward me. He said they wanted to move past the drama, but they needed stability. He said my sudden emotional outbursts were putting the family at financial risk. I opened the folder. Inside was a printed document. It was not a heartfelt letter. It was a literal contract. A financial agreement. It outlined a schedule of payments. It demanded that I resume paying Chelsea's tuition, Cameron's rent, and the property taxes. It even included a clause about the down payment for the new SUV Evelyn wanted, categorizing it as back pay for the emotional distress I had caused them by ruining the wedding photos. At the bottom, there were signature lines for me, George, and Evelyn. I stared at the paper. It was so incredibly absurd that I actually laughed out loud. It was not a happy laugh. It was a hollow, echoing sound. They did not want their daughter back. They wanted their ATM machine to sign a new service agreement. I looked up at Evelyn. I asked her if anyone in this room had even a single ounce of remorse for what they said to Finn. Silence. Cameron kept looking at his phone. Chelsea rolled her eyes. George crossed his arms. I took the printed contract in my hands, tore it perfectly down the middle, and let the pieces flutter to the dining room floor. I looked at the four of them and told them to never contact me again. I turned my back, walked out the front door, and drove home, finally completely cured of the illusion that I had a family. When I got home from that terrible dinner, I told Grant everything. I told him about the printed contract, the accusations of him brainwashing me, and the absolute lack of remorse. Grant just held me while I cried out the last few tears I had left for those people. I thought it was over. I thought tearing up that ridiculous contract and walking out the door was the grand finale. But I underestimated their desperation. When a parasite realizes its host has cut off the blood supply, it does not just die quietly. It looks for a new way to attach itself. Since they could no longer control me, they decided to target Grant. 3 days after the dinner, Grant was sitting in his office at the engineering firm when his personal cell phone rang. He did not recognize the number, but he answered it anyway. It was George. My father had somehow tracked down Grant's direct line, likely by calling his company's front desk and pretending there was a family emergency. Grant told me later exactly how the conversation went. George put on his best concerned father voice. He sounded tired, heavy, and full of fake wisdom. He told Grant that he knew things had been tense, but he wanted to handle this man to man. He said the women in the family were too emotional and dramatic, and they needed the men to sit down, grab a cup of coffee, and figure out a logical solution to Caroline's recent mental breakdown. George framed it perfectly. He painted me as a hysterical, unstable woman who was tearing the family apart because of postpartum depression or stress, even though Finn was 8 years old. He told Grant that he was worried about Grant's future, being tied to a woman who would randomly cut off her own parents. He asked Grant to meet him at a small, quiet cafe downtown the following afternoon, just the two of them, to talk sense into each other. Most men would have hung up the phone. But Grant is not most men. Grant is methodical. He knew exactly what George was trying to do, and he knew that if he refused the meeting, my family would just keep circling our house like vultures, looking for another way in. Grant realized he needed to give them the rope they were so desperate to hang themselves with. Grant agreed to the meeting. He did not tell me about the phone call that night because he did not want to send me into another panic attack. Instead, he went into his home office, opened his laptop, and started gathering the final pieces of a puzzle he had been working on in secret since before our wedding. The next afternoon, Grant left work early. He put his phone in his breast pocket, hit the record button on his voice memo app, and walked into the downtown cafe. He was expecting to sit down with George, have a tense conversation, and tell him to back off. But when Grant walked through the glass doors of the cafe, he saw that George was not alone. Sitting in a large circular booth in the back corner of the restaurant was my entire family. George, Evelyn, Cameron, and Chelsea. They had ambushed him. They thought that if they surrounded him, for against one, they could intimidate him into submission. They thought they could break him down, convince him I was crazy, and force him to make me sign that financial contract. Grant did not turn around and leave. He calmly walked over to the booth, pulled up a chair on the opposite side of the table, and sat down. He did not order a coffee. He just looked at the four of them, folded his hands on the table, and waited for them to start the show. Evelyn took the lead, of course. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, putting on her most sympathetic, motherly face. She looked at Grant and started the character assassination. She told Grant that they felt so sorry for him. She said he had walked blindly into a massive mess. She painted a picture of me as a deeply flawed, unstable person who had always been a problem child. She told him that I had a history of making irrational, impulsive decisions and pushing away the people who loved me most. Then Cameron chimed in. My brother, who had not worked a full-time job in 3 years, looked Grant in the eye and said that I was a financial liability. Cameron said I was terrible with money, that I was always hiding things, and that Grant needed to take full control of my bank accounts before I bankrupted our new marriage. Chelsea nodded along, adding that I was deeply insecure and that my obsession with Finn was unnatural. That is when they crossed the final line. They started attacking my son again. George told Grant, man to man, that raising another guy's kid was a noble thing to do, but it was not his responsibility. George said Finn came from bad genetics, from a broken home, and that the boy was already showing signs of being troubled. Evelyn added that Finn was a wedge between me and my real family, and she actually suggested, out loud, that Grant should convince me to send Finn to a boarding school so Grant and I could focus on having our own, real children. They sat there in that public cafe, sipping their lattes, casually suggesting that a man should manipulate his wife into abandoning her 8-year-old son. They thought they were being incredibly persuasive. They thought they were saving Grant from a ruined life. Grant sat in silence for a full 10 minutes. He let them talk. He let them pile on the lies, the insults, and the toxic advice. He let the voice recorder in his pocket capture every single vile word. He watched their faces, memorizing the absolute lack of human decency in their eyes. When Evelyn finally stopped talking, she reached out and patted Grant's hand. She said, "We just want what is best for you, Grant. You are a smart man. You can see she is out of control. We can help you manage her, but you have to get her to reinstate the financial support she owes this family." Grant slowly pulled his hand away from Evelyn's touch. He leaned back in his chair, unbuttoned his suit jacket, and took a deep breath. He looked at George and said, "It is fascinating listening to you four talk about financial liabilities." The table went quiet. The smug smiles on Cameron and Chelsea's faces began to fade. Grant's voice was completely devoid of emotion, like a judge reading a sentence. He asked George if he remembered the credit check that got flagged a few months before the wedding, when Caroline and Grant were trying to buy a new car. George shifted uncomfortably in the booth but did not answer. Grant continued. He said that Caroline was confused by the hard inquiries on her credit report, but she trusted her family too much to suspect anything sinister. Grant, however, did not trust them at all. He said he noticed the inconsistencies. He noticed the strange mail that sometimes arrived at our house from banks we did not use. So, Grant did what any logical engineer would do. He hired a professional to look at the math. Grant reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small, silver USB drive. He placed it directly in the center of the cafe table. The piece of metal caught the overhead lights. Everyone stared at it like it was a live grenade. Grant looked at my father. He told him that 3 months ago, he hired a forensic accountant. He gave the accountant access to all of Caroline's public financial records, her credit history, and the tax documents she had lying around the house. He said the accountant found some very interesting things. Grant pointed to George and said, "Let us start with the house." 2 years ago, George and Evelyn took out a second mortgage on their home, a line of credit for $80,000. But because George's credit was terrible, he needed a cosigner. Instead of asking Caroline, which she probably would have foolishly agreed to back then, they simply forged her signature on the loan documents. They committed federal identity theft to secure $80,000, tying Caroline to a massive debt she knew nothing about. George's face turned the color of ash. He opened his mouth to speak, but he was choking on his own panic. Grant then turned to Evelyn. He asked her about the college fund. When Finn was born, Caroline set up a small savings account, depositing $50 a month for his future. Because Caroline was young and still living at home at the time, Evelyn was listed as a joint custodian on the account. Grant revealed that over the last 8 years, Evelyn had been secretly siphoning money out of her grandson's college fund. She had drained nearly $4,000 to pay off her own luxury credit card bills, leaving Finn with almost nothing. Evelyn put her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Finally, Grant looked at Cameron. He detailed a fraudulent business loan Cameron had applied for online, using Caroline's social security number as a guarantor. The loan had defaulted 6 months ago, which is what tanked Caroline's credit score right before the wedding. Grant looked at the four of them. They were completely paralyzed. The arrogant, manipulative monsters who had walked into the cafe were gone, replaced by terrified criminals who had just been caught red-handed. Grant spoke in a low, dangerous whisper. He told them that everything they had just said about Caroline, and more importantly, everything they had said about Finn, was recorded. But that did not even matter compared to what was on the USB drive. He said the drive contained bank statements, forged signature analyses, and IP addresses showing where the fraudulent loans were applied for. He told them it was a neat, perfectly organized package of federal felonies, ready to be handed over to the police, the IRS, and the bank fraud department. Evelyn started to cry. Real tears this time. She reached across the table, her hands shaking, and whispered that Grant did not understand, that they were family, and that George was going to pay it all back. George stuttered, agreeing, saying they just needed a little more time and they did not want to bother Caroline with the details. Grant stood up from the table. He did not yell. He did not cause a scene. He just looked down at them with absolute disgust. He told them they were not family. They were thieves. He picked up the USB drive, slipped it back into his pocket, and told them that they had 72 hours to prepare themselves, because Caroline was going to dictate exactly how the rest of their lives were going to play out. Grant turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving my parents and siblings sitting in the booth, entirely destroyed by the truth. When Grant came home that evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner. He walked in, took off his coat, and asked me to sit down at the table. He pulled the silver USB drive out of his pocket, set it down in front of me, and told me everything. He played the audio recording from the cafe. I sat there in silence, listening to my own mother suggest that I send my 8-year-old son away to a boarding school so she could have better access to my husband's wallet. I listened to my father call my sweet boy bad genetics. But the true heartbreak came when Grant opened the files on his laptop. Seeing the forged signatures was like being punched in the stomach. Seeing the bank statements from Finn's college fund, watching the balance drop from thousands of dollars to just $32, broke something deep inside my soul. They had not just stolen from me. They had stolen from a child. They had robbed my son of his future just to buy designer shoes and pay off bad debts. I did not cry. I think I had finally run out of tears for these people. The sadness was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculated, and absolute fury. The trauma bond was dead. The little girl who just wanted her mother's love was gone. I was a mother protecting her cub, and they had just handed me the weapon to destroy them. I took my phone out of my pocket. I opened the family group chat, the one I had muted weeks ago. I did not write a paragraph. I did not express my anger. I typed 2 sentences. Dinner at my place. Friday at 7 o'clock. Be on time. I hit send. I did not include any emojis. I did not give them any context. I knew they would be terrified. I knew they would spend the next 2 days sweating, wondering what I was going to do. Grant looked at me, a proud, quiet smile on his face, and asked me what the plan was. I told him the plan was to finally cut the infection out for good. Friday at 7 o'clock arrived. The doorbell rang exactly on the hour. They were not late. I opened the door. George, Evelyn, Cameron, and Chelsea stood on my porch. They looked exhausted. George had dark circles under his eyes, and Evelyn was not wearing her usual heavy makeup. They walked into my dining room like they were walking into a courtroom. I had set the dining table, but there was no food. Instead, neatly placed at the 4 seats, were 4 manila folders. Inside each folder was a printed copy of the forensic accountant's report, highlighting every forged signature, every stolen dollar, and every fraudulent loan application. They sat down. No one spoke. Grant stood quietly in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, watching over me. I stood at the head of the table. I looked at the people who gave me life, the people who were supposed to protect me, and I felt absolutely nothing for them. I laid out my terms. I told George and Evelyn they had exactly 60 days to refinance their house and remove my name from the second mortgage. I told Cameron he had 60 days to pay off the fraudulent business loan in full. And I told Evelyn she had exactly 1 week to wire the $4,000 she stole from Finn's account back into my bank. I told them if they missed a single deadline, by even 1 minute, I would take the silver USB drive directly to the police station and press criminal charges for identity theft and fraud against all of them. George tried to speak. He tried to say 60 days was impossible with the current interest rates. I slammed my hand on the table, silencing him instantly. I told him that was his problem, not mine. I told them this was not a negotiation. It was a sentence. I told them to take their folders, get out of my house, and never, ever speak to me or my son again. They stood up. There were no arguments. There were no fake apologies. They picked up their folders of shame and walked out the front door in total silence. I watched their car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. A month later, after the loans were miraculously paid off and my name was cleared, a fancy gold-lettered invitation arrived in the mail. It was from Evelyn, inviting us to Sunday brunch, trying to pretend the whole thing never happened. I did not even open it. I dropped it straight into the paper shredder. I walked out to the backyard. Grant was pushing Finn on the swing set, both of them laughing so hard they could barely breathe. I stood there watching them, feeling the warm sun on my face. I realized then that blood does not make a family. Respect, loyalty, and protection do. I had finally lost my parents, but I had gained the entire world. Looking back, walking away from the people who gave me life was the hardest, yet most liberating thing I have ever done. But I leave it to you, the listeners. Am I wrong for threatening my own parents with jail time over money, or was completely erasing my biological family the only way to protect my son? Thank you for listening to my story. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button and turn on notifications to join our community for more intense, unbelievable family dramas. Leave your verdict in the comments below.